New ethanol standards the EPA recently announced could impact thousands of farmers and affect how much you pay at the grocery store and at the gas pump. A law in 2005 created the Renewable Fuel Standard, which sets yearly volumes for how much ethanol and other advanced fuels are mixed into gasoline. The EPA's new ethanol standards are lower than those previously required. The agency maintains that the new targets represent, quote, responsible growth. But as Sarah Whitmire reports, Indiana farmers are accusing the EPA of giving into the oil industry by limiting ethanol use.
When you pull in to fill up at most gas stations, you might not put a lot of thought into what's going into your tank. Some pumps are clearly labeled with E90 or E85. These labels represent how much ethanol is in the gasoline. But the regular fuel that gas stations sell also contains ethanol, about 10%.
We need higher blends in gasoline. We need 15%, 30% mid-level blends. We need to allow the consumer to choose.
In addition to representing the Indiana Ethanol Producers Association, Dave Hudak manages this Poet ethanol plant about an hour northeast of Indianapolis, where corn is ground into a fine dust that's eventually processed into liquid ethanol. The EPA mandates how much of that ethanol is blended into the fuel supply. The agency is supposed to set new levels each year, but it hadn't since 2013. The new levels announced at the end of last month require refiners to use less ethanol than previously mandated. 16.3 billion gallons of renewable fuel this year compared to the old mandate of 20.5 billion, and 17.4 billion gallons next year, 4.85 billion gallons less than the previous mandate.
We're just disappointed that the EPA didn't follow the standard. They chose to arbitrarily pick another number.
The EPA maintains it wasn't an arbitrary decision, as Hudak calls it. The agency says the old targets were too aggressive. People are driving less and therefore using less gasoline. And many engines aren't able to run on a blend that contains more than 10% ethanol.
The ethanol industry and the farmers in the agricultural industry, they did what they were supposed to do. Our job was to produce the amount of ethanol and continue to produce at the volumes required. So we did. The oil company's job was to find the way to deliver it to the consumers, and they drug their feet on it. And so now we're at a situation where the only way to get more ethanol in to the consumer is to add it to the existing gasoline supply, and of course they're reluctant to do that.
Hudak says Indiana ethanol producers can produce about 1 billion gallons of ethanol each year, so the EPA's new standards will impact the agricultural industry and farmers like Chris Mann, whose livelihood depends on corn.
We produce about 4,000 acres of corn around Cloverdale, Indiana, and about 50% of that corn goes to our local ethanol plant for ethanol production.
Indiana farmers saw the price of corn double when the EPA initially established the renewable fuel standard. It's relatively stable now in the $4 range.
It's been a tremendous profitable situation for Indiana farmers to have ethanol as another usage of corn. We grow way more corn in this state than what we need for food or feed, and adding ethanol as a use for that, allowing corn to be used as a fuel, has been just tremendous for the Indiana rural economy.
But the ethanol industry has its opponents, and the debate has made strange bedfellows of oil companies who compete with biofuels and certain environmentalists. Both advocate for lowering the ethanol mandate.
We're using about 40% of our corn production to produce ethanol. So that takes a big environmental toll. One, it's bad for the climate. It increases carbon emissions because when you plow up soil and grassland, you're increasing carbon emissions. Another one is water quality. Corn is one of the most resource-intensive crops that we grow. It requires more nitrogen fertilizer than almost any other crop. And that fertilizer runs off into waterways, making local water more expensive to treat.
Lignocellulosic material, that's the fancy word for the woody waste that's left over after you harvest plants,
Peter Schubert directs the Richard Lugar Center for Renewable Energy, headquartered at IUPUI. He says while the EPA's proposed requirements are disappointing, they are practical. He argues the real future of biofuels lies in cellulosic-based ethanol that's created from crop waste products like corn husks, and it's relatively environmentally friendly.
Corn-based ethanol is often called a bridge fuel that would fill the gap until the technology is ready to do the cellulosic-based ethanol, and that makes a lot of sense. But then once you've established that as an industry, then now that industry will want to protect itself and perpetuate itself as well. And that's good for corn farmers. It keeps corn prices up, and it's a domestic supply, so there's a lot of really good reasons to do that. But at the same time, that needs to be balanced with the research and development and the loan guarantees and the infrastructure required to do the second generation portions.
By lowering this standard, Schubert says there's less pressure on the industry to come up with ideas for more efficient alternative fuels and make them more economical. And in recent years, Schubert says the amount of money the federal government spends on renewable energy research has actually dropped. That means there's less money for the kind of research done here at the Lugar Center that could lead to advanced alternative fuels.
The new EPA rules have to go through a public comment period before being adopted. That comment period ends July 27th.